Imagine a coastal town, buried in white silence, where the sea itself seems to breathe secrets beneath the ice. A police officer races through a raging blizzard to save a stranger trapped under the frozen waves. But what she finds that night is more than a rescue. It is the beginning of a mystery that will uncover long-lost guilt and forgotten faith. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from and how storms have changed your life. Leave a comment below and let us know your corner of the world. The town of Raven Point, perched on the northern edge of Maine's frozen coastline, looked like a ghost that winter. The ocean was no longer blue but steel gray, frozen at its edges, and the horizon disappeared behind curtains of snow. Wind screamed through the harbor cranes and the lighthouse, its beam half buried in white haze, blinked like a weary eye refusing to close. The storm had come faster than the forecasts predicted, cutting Raven Point off from the mainland. The roads were now ribbons of ice, and the radio channels were flooded with static and emergency calls. Officer Mara Callan, 32, was among the few still out there. She drove the department's snow-equipped SUV through the blinding flurries, knuckles pale around the steering wheel. Tall and broad-shouldered beneath her heavy parka, with strands of auburn hair escaping her hood, she carried herself with the calm precision of someone who had learned to think under pressure. Yet, behind her steady gaze was the weariness of someone who had lost too much to storms like this. Her father, Captain Robert Callan, who never returned from sea 12 winters ago. Since then, Mara had sworn to save what the ocean tried to take. That oath was what pulled her into this blizzard. The radio crackled. Unit 3, this is dispatch. Report of a truck skidded off Highway 11 near the frozen creek. Possible occupant trapped. Over? Mara's breath fogged inside the cab. Copy that, en route. She pressed harder on the accelerator. The headlights cut through a world of swirling white. Every few seconds, the wind howled so loud it felt like the sky itself was breaking apart. When she reached the site, her tires fought for grip on the sloping road. Down below, she could barely make out the shape of a pickup truck, half submerged in the ice. The vehicle tilted toward the dark water, its hazard lights flickering weakly through the snow like a heartbeat fading. Mara grabbed her emergency kit, secured a rope around her waist, and shouted into the wind, "Police! Can you hear me?" A faint cry answered, a woman's voice, old and weak. Mara fastened the rope to a pine at the edge of the road and began to move carefully down the slope, her boots breaking through crusts of snow. The ice moaned beneath her. She was halfway across when a sharp crack echoed. The surface began to split like glass. And then, out of the storm, came a shape, first a dark blur, then the distinct silhouette of a man and a large dog breaking through the white. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone used to danger. Eli Ward, 35, was tall, with a build honed by years of military training, broad chest, sun-weathered skin, and dark hair now coated with frost. His eyes, gray-blue like the sea before a storm, scanned the scene with measured calm. He wore a Navy survival jacket with tactical straps and carried a coil of rope over his shoulder. His voice cut through the wind. "Don't move. Another step! The ice won't hold your weight there." Beside him, Ranger, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable and tan coat, barked sharply as if confirming the warning. Snow clung to his fur, his breath steaming in quick bursts. His intelligent eyes flicked between Mara and the sinking truck. "I've got a victim inside," Mara called back, struggling to stay balanced. "Then we move now," Eli said, tying off a second rope to a stump. "You take her arms when I break the door." The two worked in silence, their movements instinctive, almost synchronized. Eli crawled closer to the truck, using his elbows to distribute weight. Ranger followed behind, low to the ice. The rope's end looped around his harness. The dog's claws clicked softly, his ears flat against the wind. Eli reached the driver's side and struck the window with the butt of his survival knife. The glass shattered. Inside, an elderly woman lay slumped across the seat, her lips blue. "Stay with me, ma'am," he murmured, reaching in. He grabbed her arm, then signaled to Mara. Together, they pulled. The ice groaned beneath them again, threatening to break completely. "Go, Ranger," Eli commanded. The German shepherd pivoted and began pulling the rope backward, muscles rippling under his coat. The line went taut. Mara used it as leverage to drag the woman onto the firmer edge. Then, with one last heave, They were all back on solid ground, as the truck gave a final creak and disappeared into the black water below. The woman gasped weakly. Her name was Evelyn Rowe, 70, small and frail, wrapped in an old wool coat soaked through. Her silver hair stuck to her forehead, her face etched with the deep lines of someone who had weathered more winters than most. My house," she stammered. "You must get me home before the wind." Mara knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "We'll get you somewhere warm, ma'am." Eli stripped off his gloves and pressed his fingers to the woman's wrist. "Pulse is weak. She's hypothermic." His tone was calm, efficient, habitual, the voice of someone who'd faced emergencies too often. He glanced at Mara. "Nearest medical post?" "Closed. Roads are blocked all the way to the mainland." "Then her home's our only shot," Eli replied. "We stabilize her there." Mara looked at him, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "You military?" "Was," Eli said simply. "Navy SEAL. I'm stationed near here for cold weather training." Mara exhaled, a mix of relief and curiosity. "Figures. You handle chaos too calmly." He gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Chaos has a way of teaching patience." They worked together to carry Evelyn into Mara's vehicle. Ranger jumped into the back, curling protectively around the woman's legs, his fur radiating warmth. The drive to the cliffs was slow and treacherous, the wipers struggling against the snows, relentless assault. "Your dog's well trained," Mara said, keeping her eyes on the barely visible road. "Ranger's more partner than pet," Eli replied, one hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder. "Served 2 tours with me overseas, saved my life more times than I can count." Mara nodded. "Good to have a partner you can trust." Eli's gaze lingered on the storm outside. "Trust keeps you alive out here." After nearly an hour, they reached the cliffs. Evelyn's house emerged through the snow, a lone, weather-beaten structure clinging to the rock face above the sea. Its windows glowed faintly, though the wind howled so violently it seemed the walls might collapse. The place looked both fragile and eternal, like it had been waiting decades for someone to return. Eli lifted Evelyn gently, carrying her inside. The interior was dim, but surprisingly orderly. Shelves lined with ship models, old maritime charts pinned to the walls, a brass telescope by the window. The air smelled faintly of salt and kerosene. Mara started a fire, while Eli wrapped Evelyn in blankets, checking her breathing. Outside, the storm raged harder, waves crashing against the cliffs with the sound of thunder. Ranger paced near the door, occasionally glancing toward the windows as if guarding against something unseen. Mara finally sat down, exhausted, her gloved hands trembling slightly. "That was too close," Eli nodded. "Storm's only getting worse. We'll have to ride it out here." Evelyn stirred, opening her eyes briefly. She whispered something barely audible. "You shouldn't have come here," before drifting back into unconsciousness. Mara frowned. What did she mean? Eli shook his head, staring at the old radio buzzing faintly on the mantel. "We'll ask her when she's strong enough." For a moment, the room was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the sea. Ranger lay beside the hearth, his head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Mara looked toward the storm-beaten window, where snow pressed against the glass like ghostly hands. The whole world outside seemed frozen in that moment, waiting. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the same tension. The sense that this night was not just about a rescue, but about something older, hidden beneath the ice and years of silence. And as lightning flashed over the cliffs, illuminating the frail woman on the couch, the soldier by the fire, and the loyal dog standing guard, the storm howled louder, as if the past itself had woken. The wind screamed along the cliffside, carrying shards of snow that glittered like broken glass in the beam of the old lighthouse. Raven Point was gone now, swallowed by the storm below, and the world beyond Evelyn Rowe's house was nothing but white and roaring sound. Inside, the glow from the fireplace fought to hold the darkness at bay, flickering across the walls lined with maritime relics and dust-laden shelves. Evelyn's home stood on a jagged outcrop of rock where the Atlantic's fury met Maine's frozen bones. The house itself was a relic of another century, built from gray driftwood and reinforced with iron nails that had long turned the color of rusted blood. Waves thundered far below, the sound rising through the floorboards like the breath of some ancient creature that refused to die. Officer Mara Callan stirred the fire, watching sparks leap upward. Her uniform hung damp by the hearth, steam rising from it in the dim light. Her face, pale from exhaustion but still sharp with vigilance, reflected both strength and unease. She had seen wrecks before, but this house felt different. It wasn't merely old, it carried a silence heavy with memory. Across the room, Eli Ward checked Evelyn's vitals again. His movements were precise, economical, every gesture a residue of his military discipline. Beneath the dim oil lamp, his features seemed chiseled from stone. Square jaw, faint scar near his temple, frost still caught in his dark stubble. His calm was the kind forged from years of surviving chaos. But there was a weight behind his eyes, a private grief he never spoke of. Ranger, the German shepherd, sat alert beside Evelyn's couch. His fur gleamed golden near the firelight, ears twitching with each howl of wind. At 4 years old, he carried himself with a balance of maturity and fierce loyalty. His nose twitched every few seconds, reading the air like a language only he understood. Evelyn Rowe, 70 and frail as sea glass, stirred awake. Her silver hair fanned across the pillow, and the firelight deepened the hollow of her cheeks. She had once been tall and proud, a woman who spent decades tending the lighthouse keep where her husband worked. But time and loss had bent her shoulders and slowed her breath. Her eyes opened, blue and distant, as if seeing ghosts instead of faces. "You shouldn't have brought me back," she murmured. Her voice trembled not from cold, but from fear. Mara leaned closer. "You needed warmth, ma'am. The roads are closed. We'll stay until the storm passes." Evelyn's gaze drifted toward the hallway, her fingers gripping the blanket. "Storms don't pass here. They only circle back." Eli met Mara's eyes, silent but watchful. He had heard tone like that before, from people who had lost something they could never bury. He rose and began exploring the room, scanning the framed photos along the wall, black and white portraits of men in naval uniforms. A young woman, smiling beside a ship christened Aurora. A boy of 10 standing with a small model sailboat. Time had frozen them there, mid-laughter. "Your husband served?" Eli asked gently. Evelyn nodded faintly. "Captain Rowe. He built models when he wasn't at sea. Said the sea was too big to master, so he tried to hold it in miniature." Her voice thinned to a whisper. "He took our boy with him that last night." Silence fell. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the air. Mara stood, brushing her palms on her uniform pants. "We'll get some food in you, Mrs. Rowe. I saw a kitchen through there." Evelyn's hand shot up. "Don't—" She stopped herself, eyes darting toward the end of the hallway. A heavy oak door stood there, its brass handle tarnished green, secured with an old padlock. "What's behind that?" Mara asked. "Nothing," Evelyn said too quickly. "Just storage." But Ranger began to growl, a low, uneasy sound from deep in his chest. He moved closer to the hallway, nose raised, tail stiff. Eli stepped beside him. "He smells something." "It's probably mice," Evelyn whispered, voice trembling. "This place, it keeps sounds, memories." Eli crouched, hand on the dog's collar. Ranger doesn't growl at memories. The storm rumbled like distant thunder. For a long while, only the fire spoke, its crackle filling the uneasy silence. Mara returned from the kitchen with a kettle of water and instant coffee she found on a shelf. The air smelled faintly of salt and old varnish. "We'll make do here until dawn," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. As the night deepened, the storm outside became a living thing. The windows rattled, and the radio on the mantel began to hiss with static again. Every few minutes, faint voices would rise and vanish, as if carried by the wind from another time. Evelyn's eyes darted to the sound. She rose suddenly, unsteady but determined, and turned the dial off. "Don't listen to it," she muttered. "Why?" Mara asked quietly. Evelyn sank back into her chair, wrapping the blanket tighter. "Because sometimes the sea talks back." Ranger gave a short bark at that moment, snapping the tension like glass. He moved to the front door, scratching softly, as though warning of something unseen. Eli checked the latch. The storm roared on, flakes swirling past the windows like ashes. To distract Evelyn, Mara began talking, asking simple questions about the area, the cliffs, how long she'd lived here. Slowly, the older woman's breathing calmed. "All my life," she said, "this house belonged to my husband's father before him. Every captain who sailed from this coast stopped here at least once. They called it the Watcher's House, said you could see the light of every lost ship from its windows." Eli glanced outside at the storm, where nothing could be seen but white. "You still believe that?" Evelyn's gaze fixed on the flames. "Believe? No, but I remember. And sometimes memory is the crueler thing." The clock ticked softly on the wall, its pendulum swaying to the rhythm of the wind. Later that night, as Mara dozed in a chair, Eli checked the door to the hallway again. He ran his fingers across the brass padlock. It was old but recently polished. Someone had touched it not long ago. He looked over his shoulder. Evelyn's eyes were open, watching him in the dark. "Some doors stay closed for good reason," she said. Eli gave a small nod. "Maybe. But storms have a way of breaking locks." Evelyn said nothing more. She turned her gaze back to the fire, where the flames painted long shadows across the ship models that lined the walls, each one gleaming faintly, as if the sea inside them still moved. By midnight, the storm reached its peak. The sound was deafening, a constant scream of wind and ocean. The house shuddered. Then, through the noise, came a faint click, the radio turning on by itself. Mara jolted awake. The device hissed and crackled, filling the room with static. A voice flickered through it, distant and distorted, almost a whisper carried on waves of snow. "Mayday, this is Silver Star. Engine down, coordinates." The message broke apart, then repeated, weaker. Eli turned toward the radio. "That's a distress call." Mara's heart slammed against her ribs. "Silver Star?" she whispered. No, it can't be." Eli glanced at her. "You know that name?" "My brother," she said slowly, voice hollow. "Noah Callan. He captains that boat." Evelyn froze. The color drained from her face. The room seemed to grow colder, as though the storm had slipped inside. "Callan?" she breathed, the word trembling from her lips. The wind howled louder, shaking the windows. Mara reached for the radio, adjusting the dial, desperate to catch the signal again. "This is Officer Mara Callan, Raven Point Rescue. Repeat, we received your transmission, Silver Star. Give your position." Static answered. Eli grabbed a nautical map from the wall and spread it on the table. "The current runs northeast from the bay. If his engine's out, the wind's driving him straight toward the shoals." Evelyn rose, her blanket falling to the floor. "No," she whispered almost to herself. "Not again!" Ranger barked sharply as if echoing the tension. The old woman clutched the edge of the table, eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "I told you storms don't pass here. They bring back what you've lost." Eli looked between her and Mara. "Then maybe it's time we find out what exactly this house has been waiting for." Outside, lightning split the sky. The storm, relentless and alive, battered the walls as if demanding to be heard. And in that moment, the Watcher's house seemed to breathe, to wake, its windows glowing faintly like eyes opening to the sea. The three of them stood in silence, listening to the static that faded into the wind. The past had begun to speak again. The night stretched on without mercy. The blizzard outside was no longer just weather. It was a living thing, prowling, whispering, testing every corner of the old house on the cliff. The walls shivered with every gust, the lantern flame bending like it wanted to hide. Mara Callan stood frozen beside the old radio, her breath visible in the cold. Her hand still hovered near the dial, unwilling to let go, as if her touch alone could keep the voice of her brother from slipping back into static. "Silver Star," she whispered again, the name breaking apart in her throat. Eli Ward crouched beside her, his jaw tense. His calm, that soldier's composure that had carried him through war and rescue alike, was now tinged with something else, determination sharpened by empathy. "We can still trace the signal," he said, scanning the dials. "If it's repeating, there's a chance they're still broadcasting from somewhere near the coast." Mara nodded numbly, eyes flicking to the window, where snow swirled in endless white. "He shouldn't have been out there. He promised he'd stay docked this season." Eli said nothing for a moment. His gloved hand adjusted the tuner, drawing out a faint hum of static like distant waves. "People break promises to survive," he murmured. Behind them, Ranger stood near the door, his ears pricked, body taut with alertness. He paced in slow arcs, pausing now and then to look toward the hallway that led to the locked door. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hiss of the storm, made him growl softly, as if the house itself made him uneasy. Evelyn Rose sat slumped near the fire, her blanket draped around her shoulders like a shroud. The orange glow cast deep shadows across her face, emphasizing the hollow beneath her cheekbones. Her hands trembled around the mug Mara had given her earlier, untouched, the steam long gone cold. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "You said your name was Callan?" Mara turned. "Yes. Officer Mara Callan, my brother, Noah, is captain of the Silver Star." "Why?" The old woman's eyes darkened. For a heartbeat, she seemed to drift somewhere far away, her lips trembling as if fighting a memory. "Because I've heard that name before," she said slowly. "Long ago, before the sea took everything from me." Eli shot her a careful look. "You knew her family?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her gaze slid toward the hallway, the one with the brass padlock. The storm outside groaned against the window pane, and for a long moment, it was as if the house was listening too. "Your father," she whispered finally. "Robert Callan. He commanded the search when the Aurora went down. He told me my husband and son were lost, that no one could have survived." Mara stiffened. "My father!" She stepped closer, unsure what to say. "He did everything he could. The Coast Guard spent days. 3 days!" Evelyn snapped, her frail voice cracking like breaking glass. 3 days, and then he left them to the sea." Eli rose slowly, placing himself between the two women, his tone even but firm. "Evelyn, this isn't the time." But the old woman wasn't listening. She was shaking now, the fury of years rising in her eyes. "He could have looked longer. He could have found them." Mara clenched her fists, trying to hold back the ache that spread through her chest. "He didn't stop because he gave up," she said quietly. "He stopped because the sea was still taking ships, and he couldn't lose anyone else." Evelyn turned away, her shoulders trembling. "Then maybe he should have let me go too." The fire hissed, a log collapsing into embers. The room filled with a silence heavy as the storm itself. Eli exhaled slowly, his voice softer now. "We'll talk about this later. Right now, there's a crew out there fighting for their lives." He nodded toward the radio. "We can argue with the past when the living are safe." Ranger barked once, breaking the tension, his nose pressed to the window. The blizzard beyond was thick, but Eli could just make out faint flashes of light, distant, rhythmic. "Search beacons," he muttered. Mara joined him, peering into the storm. "No, too far off the coast. Could be lightning, or maybe the wreck flares." Eli checked the map again, spreading it across the table. His gloved finger traced a line from the lighthouse to the shoal marks just offshore. If Noah's signal came through here, he's somewhere along the drift between the North Shoal and the old reef. If his engine failed, he's drifting toward the rocks. Mara's eyes followed the map, her mind working fast despite the dread. If he's that close, the signal tower at Harbor Point might pick him up. But it's cut off. We need to triangulate manually. Eli gave a small nod, a glint of approval in his gaze. "You know your navigation." "My father taught me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Before the last storm." A silence fell again, thick with things neither dared say. Ranger suddenly began to bark, louder this time. He ran to the locked door and scratched at it with his paws. Mara turned, startled. "What's he doing?" Eli followed, crouching near the door. The dog's fur bristled, his nose pushed under the gap, tail rigid. A cold draft seeped from the crack beneath the frame. "There's air movement," Eli murmured. "Could be an old vent." Evelyn's voice cut through the room, sharp and trembling. "Get him away from there," Mara frowned. "Mrs. Rowe, what's behind this door?" The old woman rose unsteadily, clutching her shawl. "I told you, it's just storage, tools, and things best forgotten." Ranger wouldn't stop growling, his hackles lifted, his stare locked on the brass lock. Eli reached for it gently. "If there's a vent, or an open shaft, it could be dangerous with the storm pressure. We should check." "Don't!" Evelyn shouted, voice cracking. "That door stays closed." Mara looked at Eli. His eyes told her not to push, for now. He stood and gave Ranger a quiet command. Reluctantly, the dog stepped back, though his gaze stayed fixed on the door. The storm continued its relentless assault. Hours passed. They took turns watching the radio, noting every faint burst of sound. Eli scribbled rough coordinates onto the map each time a pulse came through. Finally, near dawn, a clearer transmission broke through the static. Star, hull breached, taking on water. This is Captain Callan. The rest dissolved into noise. Mara's heart stopped. Her brother's voice, weak, desperate, alive. "We need to get that to dispatch," she said, grabbing her radio handset. "If I can connect to the central relay—" "The relays are down," Eli reminded her, his tone careful but steady. "But if we can patch this through the house's antenna—" Eli moved toward the window, where the old radio's aerial wire snaked outside, frozen against the wall. He forced the latch open, icy air rushing in. Snow sprayed across the room, making the fire hiss. He secured a new cable from his pack, connecting it to the unit. The signal cleared slightly. A rhythmic pulse, not words this time. "Emergency beacon," Eli said. "It's automated now. They've lost power." Mara's hands shook. "If the current holds, that drift line ends at the Devil's Shoal." "That's less than 6 miles off this cliff," Eli muttered. "He's close." Evelyn sank into her chair again, face pale as chalk. 6 miles. Same as the Aurora." Her words hung in the air like frost. Mara looked at her, confusion and realization colliding. "The Aurora went down there?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Right there, on a night just like this. The sea doesn't forget, Officer Callan. It just waits to take again what it lost." Ranger whined softly, nudging Mara's knee. She crouched and stroked his head, finding comfort in his steady warmth. "Then we'll take something back from it this time," she whispered. Eli's gaze met hers, steady, resolute. "At first light, we go." The radio continued to hiss behind them, repeating its faint SOS. Outside, the storm began to ease, the first cracks of dawn bleeding through the clouds. The snow still fell, but softer now, like ash after a fire. Evelyn stared into the dying flames of the hearth, her voice low and distant. "Your father stood right where you are now, listening to that same sea. He swore he'd find the lost, but the sea doesn't bargain, Mara Callan. It takes what it's owed." Mara turned from her, eyes hardening. "Then it'll learn to give something back." And as Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching toward the whispering wind, the light flickered across the wall, revealing the shadow of the locked door behind them. The brass padlock gleamed faintly, as if waiting to be turned. The storm might have broken, but the silence that followed felt heavier still. The storm began to fade with the first light of dawn. The wind no longer screamed. It moaned, tired, dragging the last shreds of snow across the cliffs like a dying ghost. The house on the edge of Raven Point stood half buried in drifts, its windows fogged, its old boards creaking as if sighing with relief. But inside, peace did not return. The silence that came after the storm was heavier, almost sacred, as though the air itself was waiting for something to break. Mara Callan sat at the kitchen table, her eyes red from a sleepless night. The map lay spread before her, covered in Eli's pencil marks, currents, wind paths, coordinates of fading radio signals. She traced one line with her finger, lips pressed tight. Her brother's life was somewhere along that line. She could feel it. Eli Ward stood by the window, his broad frame outlined by the pale morning light. He had shed his heavy jacket, revealing a plain navy sweater stretched across his shoulders, a military dog tag glinting faintly at his neck. His expression was composed, yet his eyes were restless, scanning the gray horizon as if he could see through the fog to the wreck itself. He had been trained for calm, for patience, but every fiber of him hated waiting. Ranger, the German shepherd, lay beside the hearth, chin on his paws. His fur was dusted with soot and frost, his ears twitching at every small sound. Even in stillness, he looked alert, his body coiled like a spring, ready to respond to whatever his human needed. In the far corner of the room, Evelyn Rose sat wrapped in her shawl. Her face looked older in daylight, the lines deeper, the eyes duller. Yet behind that exhaustion was something alive, a storm quieter but no less fierce than the one outside. Her fingers played with the chain of a brass key that hung around her neck, turning it over and over, as if trying to wear down its memories. Mara rose suddenly. "I'm going out there," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "I'm not sitting here while Noah's freezing to death." Eli turned from the window. "Not yet. The wind's still gusting 30 knots, and visibility's 0 near the reef. You'd last 5 minutes out there." "I can't just wait," she said sharply. "He's my brother." "And you'll die before you reach him," Eli replied. His tone wasn't angry, just weary, the voice of someone who'd seen too many rescues turn to recoveries. Mara glared at him. "You think I don't know the risks?" "I think you're not the only one who's lost someone to the sea," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a blade. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Mara looked away, her breath shaky. "Then what do you suggest? Sit here and do nothing?" Eli hesitated, then spoke softly. "We wait until the wind drops. We plan, and when it's safe, we go." Before Mara could argue, Evelyn stirred from her chair. "You won't find peace out." "There," she murmured, her voice brittle. "Not on that water. The sea doesn't forgive, Officer Callan." Mara turned, frustration flashing in her eyes. "Forgive? What's that supposed to mean?" Evelyn's gaze lifted to hers, sharp now, almost defiant. "It means you don't know what it takes yet, to lose everything to the sea and still wake up the next morning." Eli stepped closer, his tone gentler. "Evelyn, you said your husband and son were on the Aurora, right?" The old woman's hand trembled around the key. "Yes. 30 years ago this very month." She stared into the fire, as if seeing something through it. "They left for a 2-day run. The radio cut out the second night. I waited here for 3 days. On the 4th, Captain Callan came to my door. He said the search was over." Mara's breath caught. "My father." Evelyn nodded slowly, eyes distant. "He told me there was no hope left, but I knew—" Her voice cracked. "I knew my boy was still calling me. I could feel it every night, in the wind, in the waves, but no one believed me. They called it grief, said I had to let go." She rose to her feet, clutching her shawl tight. "But how can you let go when the sea keeps whispering their names?" The fire popped. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking. The storm outside had calmed, but something inside the house had shifted. Eli watched Evelyn carefully. "What's behind that locked door, Evelyn?" Her eyes flickered. Fear, guilt, memory. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," he said quietly. For a moment she looked ready to refuse. Then her hand went to the key at her neck. "That room was my husband's workshop," she said at last. "He built ships there, models, repairs, whatever the sea left him. After the Aurora went down, I locked it. I couldn't stand the smell of salt and varnish anymore. But sometimes—" Her eyes filled with tears. "Sometimes I still hear the hammer, like he's still in there, finishing one last boat." Mara's voice softened. "Evelyn, maybe it's time to open it." The old woman shook her head violently. "No, you open that door, you wake ghosts better left in peace." But Eli stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes ghosts need to be seen before they can rest." Evelyn looked between them, the soldier, the officer, the dog watching silently by the fire. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, with trembling hands, she slipped the chain from her neck and held out the key. "I warned you," she whispered. The lock clicked open. The door creaked inward. A rush of cold air spilled out, tinged with the scent of old wood, rust, and sea salt. Dust swirled in the beam of Eli's flashlight, and what lay beyond took their breath away. The room was an old shipwright's workshop, shelves lined with tools frozen in time, curls of wood shavings on the floor, and half-finished models of boats. On the central workbench stood a large, incomplete model of a ship, the Aurora, its hull cracked but lovingly detailed. A lantern hung above it, still swinging slightly as if touched by an unseen hand. Mara stepped closer. The air felt different here, colder, heavier. "He built this?" Evelyn nodded from the doorway. "The day before he sailed. He said he wanted to finish it when he came home." Eli ran his fingers along the deck of the miniature vessel, tracing its worn paint. "He was a craftsman." "He was a dreamer," Evelyn murmured. "The sea loved men like him, and that's how it kills them, softly, like a lover." Mara studied the walls. They were covered with yellowed newspaper clippings. headlines about the Aurora's disappearance, the search effort, the declaration of loss. In one, her father's face appeared beside the caption, Captain Robert Callan ends search. No survivors expected. Her breath hitched. She turned toward Evelyn. You kept this all these years? I wanted to remember who I was angry at, Evelyn said quietly. Anger was the only thing that kept me alive. Eli looked at her with quiet understanding. And what did it give you? The old woman's eyes softened. Nothing but an empty house. The silence that followed was long, broken only by the sound of the wind brushing against the shutters. Mara stepped forward and touched the ship model. A fine layer of dust came off on her glove. You said you heard hammers, she murmured. Maybe he was just waiting for you to forgive him, to let him finish. Evelyn stared at the ship for a long time. Forgiveness is for the living, she whispered. Maybe, Eli said softly, but sometimes the dead need it more. A soft whine broke the stillness. Ranger had stepped into the doorway, head tilted, eyes fixed on the ship. He padded forward and placed one paw on the wooden stand, almost reverent. Evelyn's lips trembled. He used to keep a shepherd, she said faintly, named Scout. That dog wouldn't leave his side, even when the storm came. Ranger barked once, low and steady, as if answering the name. And in that moment, Evelyn Rowe, 70 years old, widow, survivor, keeper of grudges, finally began to cry. Not the angry tears of years past, but the quiet sobs of someone who had carried too much for too long. Eli stepped forward and gently pulled a sheet over the unfinished ship. He's home now, he said. Let the storm end here. Evelyn nodded weakly, sinking onto a nearby stool. Her eyes wandered to the window, where the gray light of morning was breaking through the clouds. The sea took them, she whispered, and I cursed the man who tried to save them. Maybe that was my sin. Mara knelt beside her. My father never stopped searching, Evelyn. He died out there trying to bring another crew home. The old woman's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around Mara's hand, frail, but fierce. Then maybe the sea wasn't punishing me, she said softly. Maybe it was keeping me alive long enough to understand. Outside, the wind finally fell silent. The snowflakes that drifted past the window glowed golden in the morning sun. Eli closed the workshop door behind them. We rest for now, he said quietly. When the storm clears completely, we find your brother. Mara nodded, wiping her eyes. Ranger leaned against her leg, his warmth grounding her to the moment. And behind the closed door, the covered ship creaked softly, as if the Aurora herself had sighed at last, free of the weight of memory. The sky over Raven Point was a bruised gray, the light of dawn diluted through layers of mist and ice. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt almost reverent. Snow lay heavy on the cliffs, blanketing every scar of the night before. In the distance, the ocean moved sluggishly, no longer roaring, but breathing in long, tired sighs. Eli Ward stood outside the house, tightening the straps of his rescue harness. His breath came in visible bursts, each one rising into the freezing air before vanishing. The cold bit deep into his skin, but he welcomed it. It kept him awake, sharp. His body bore the quiet efficiency of a man used to danger, broad shoulders under a dark survival coat, jaw set, eyes narrowed toward the horizon. Behind him, the house on the cliff looked almost peaceful in the morning light, though its windows still seemed to hold shadows. Mara Callan stepped out moments later, bundled in her uniform jacket beneath a thick parka. Her auburn hair was tucked into her hood, and her face, though pale from exhaustion, burned with purpose. Ranger padded beside her, fur glistening with frost, his amber eyes bright and steady. The German shepherd moved with a disciplined grace, his every motion controlled. 4 years of training had made him a rescue partner, as reliable as any human. Evelyn Rowe watched them from the doorway. The old woman stood wrapped in her gray shawl, her thin frame trembling in the morning wind. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of fear and reluctant hope. The current runs strong past the reef, she called. If you follow the western ledge, you'll reach a ridge that overlooks the inlet. From there, you might spot debris. Mara nodded. Thank you, Evelyn. We'll bring him back. Evelyn's fingers gripped the doorframe. The sea gives nothing for free, she murmured. Mara paused but didn't answer. She turned toward Eli. "Let's move." The trek down to the shoreline was brutal. The path was half buried under ice, and the cliffs offered no mercy, only slick rock and biting wind. The air smelled of brine and iron. Eli led the way, planting crampons into the frozen slope, occasionally glancing back to make sure Mara followed his steps. Ranger moved ahead, his nose low to the snow, tail rigid, tracking something unseen. When they reached the bottom, the beach looked like another world. Frozen driftwood, shards of ice carried by the tide, and black water swirling between sheets of snow. The remains of the storm still hissed in the air. Eli raised his binoculars. "Over there." He pointed toward a stretch of jagged rocks where a dark shape jutted from the ice. "Could be wreckage." Mara's pulse quickened. "Let's go." The closer they came, the clearer it was. A splintered section of hull, half buried in snow and seaweed. The faded letters, Silver Star, barely visible beneath the frost. Mara fell to her knees beside it, her hands trembling as she brushed away the snow. "Noah," she whispered. Eli crouched beside her, scanning the area. "There's a trail. Footprints, one set, leading inland." Ranger barked once, sharp and decisive. He had caught a scent. They followed. The prints led through the snow-covered rocks toward a narrow ravine that cut into the cliffside. Inside, the wind softened, replaced by the sound of dripping water and the distant crash of waves below. The path grew tighter until it opened into a small cove, shielded by walls of ice. And there, lying motionless on the stones, was a man. He was half buried in snow, his clothes torn, his face pale and streaked with salt. A short beard covered his jaw, and his lips were cracked from the cold. Mara's breath broke. "Noah!" She dropped to her knees, brushing snow from his face. His eyes fluttered weakly at her voice. "Mara." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "You came." Eli knelt beside them, moving quickly. "He's hypothermic, pulses weak but steady." He opened his emergency pack, pulling out thermal blankets and heating pads. "We need to raise his core temperature slowly." Ranger pressed close, curling his body along Noah's side for warmth. The dog's fur steamed in the frigid air, his eyes flicking up to Eli for command. "Good boy," Eli murmured. He wrapped the blanket around Noah, tucking the pads at his neck and chest. "Mara, hold his hands, keep circulation going." She obeyed, her gloved fingers gripping her brother's frozen ones. "We've got you," she said, voice breaking. "You're not alone." Minutes passed, long, aching minutes. Then Noah's breathing steadied. His eyes opened again, glazed but aware. I thought I'd die out here." "You're safe now," Eli said, still monitoring his vitals. But Noah shook his head weakly. "No, not safe. They made me go." Mara frowned. "Who did?" He swallowed hard. "Men from the docks, debt collectors. I owed too much. They said if I made one last run, they'd clear it. Cargo wasn't what they said. Something illegal. I tried to turn back, but the storm..." He coughed violently. "Engine died. The others. Gone." Mara's heart clenched. "You didn't have to do this alone." Noah's eyes softened. "I didn't want you to know. After Dad, I didn't want you worrying." She blinked back tears. "You think losing you would hurt less?" Eli placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can finish this conversation when he's stable. We need to move him before frostbite sets in." Together, they lifted Noah onto a stretcher Eli had carried, folded in his pack. The climb back up the ridge was slow, every step a battle. The wind returned, colder now, as if the storm had left behind a remnant of its anger. Halfway up, Noah stirred. "Mara," she looked down. "I'm here." His eyes were glassy, but there was a faint smile on his cracked lips. "Dad didn't stop looking, did he?" She hesitated, the truth catching in her throat. "No," she whispered. "He never did." Noah nodded weakly, his gaze unfocused. "He used to say the sea gives back what it owes. Eventually." By the time they reached the top, the sound of helicopter blades cut through the cold. A rescue team had spotted the flares Eli had set earlier. Within minutes, Noah was lifted into the chopper, bundled in blankets, medics swarming around him. Mara stood watching, her body shaking, not from cold but from relief. As the helicopter rose, the wind of its blades whipped snow across her face. Eli stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's harness. "He's going to make it," he said quietly. Mara nodded, eyes still on the sky. "He's alive. That's all that matters." The helicopter disappeared into the clouds. For a moment, there was only the sea, endless and gray. Eli turned toward the cliffs. "We should head back before visibility drops again." When they reached the house, the storm had truly gone. The sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the frozen sea. Evelyn sat by the fire, her eyes closing in prayer as they entered. "Did you find him?" she asked. Mara smiled faintly. "Yes. He's alive." Evelyn's shoulders sagged. "Then perhaps the sea's debt is paid." She rose slowly, walking to the table where the covered model ship still sat. With trembling hands, she lifted the sheet and reached for a small engraving tool. Her eyes glistened as she carved careful letters into the hull. "Aurora, the lost found." When she finished, she handed the ship to Eli. "Take it," she said softly. "A gift for those who refuse to stop searching." Eli looked down at it, the name glimmering faintly in the firelight. "Thank you," he said. Evelyn smiled weakly. "I spent a lifetime hating a man who did what he thought was mercy. But God, he gave me time to see the truth, to forgive, to let go." Mara's throat tightened. "Maybe he sent us here for that." Outside, Ranger barked joyfully, running circles in the snow. The sun caught on his black and tan coat, turning it into molten gold. The wind from the sea carried a faint cry of gulls, a sound that felt like blessing. Eli glanced toward the horizon. "Storm's gone," he said quietly. Mara followed his gaze. "Maybe not gone," she replied. "Just changed shape." Eli smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Like all storms do." And together they stood in the doorway, watching Ranger chase the light across the snow. Faithful, unyielding, alive. The storm had taken much, but it had given back something rarer: redemption. Far below, the sea shimmered under the rising sun, its surface calm at last. The morning that followed was like waking from a long prayer. The sea stretched wide and silver beneath the rising sun, its surface calm at last. The cliffs of Raven Point, still blanketed in snow, shimmered with a pale light that turned every icicle into a diamond. After days of howling wind and darkness, the quiet was almost holy. Inside the old house, warmth finally returned. The fire in the hearth burned steady, filling the air with the scent of pine and salt. Evelyn Rose sat near it, her fragile hands folded on her lap. The lines on her face seemed softer now, her eyes clearer. The night's pain had not vanished, but it had settled, like a storm that had spent its fury and found peace in exhaustion. Across from her, Mara Callan stirred her coffee, still in her winter jacket, though the room was warm. The exhaustion in her eyes was mixed with something new: gratitude, quiet, and deep. The helicopter had taken Noah to the regional hospital at dawn. The latest radio message said he would survive. His body was frostbitten, but his heart was strong. Mara could finally breathe. Eli Ward stood near the window, his silhouette framed by light. The soldier's posture never left him, shoulders squared, back straight, but his eyes softened as he watched Ranger outside. The German shepherd bounded through the snowdrifts, leaving trails of paw prints that glowed like scattered stars. Every few moments he'd stop, sniff the air, and bark toward the sea as if greeting an old friend. "It's strange," Evelyn said quietly. "After a storm, the sea always looks innocent, like it never meant any of it." Mara turned, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Maybe it didn't. Maybe storms are just what it does to stay alive." Evelyn chuckled softly, a brittle sound but warm. "You sound like my husband. He used to say the sea was God's mirror, beautiful and cruel because we see ourselves in it." Eli finally stepped away from the window. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes he uses storms to remind us what still matters." He took a seat near the fire, stretching his hands toward the heat. "Out there, when you're freezing, the only thing that keeps you moving is faith. Faith that someone's waiting on the other side." Mara glanced at him, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. "You've been through worse, haven't you?" Eli shrugged, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The ocean's kinder than war. At least it tells you when it's coming." For a moment, they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. Evelyn reached for the model ship on the table, the Aurora, her husband's unfinished masterpiece. The morning light gleamed along its hull, catching on the fresh carving she had made. Aurora, the lost found. Her fingers lingered over the name. "I think," she whispered, "it's finally finished." Mara watched her, eyes glistening. "You're sure?" Evelyn nodded. "He can rest now. All of them can." Outside, Ranger barked again, this time sharp and playful. Eli smiled and rose, pulling on his coat. "He's restless. I'll take him down the trail." Mara hesitated. "I'll come with you." They stepped outside together, the cold air crisp and alive. The path wound down toward the cliff edge, where the sea spread endless and bright. Ranger ran ahead, his paws kicking up clouds of snow. Seabirds wheeled in the distance, their cries echoing faintly across the water. For the first time in days, the world seemed to breathe again. Mara stopped near the edge, the wind tugging at her hood. "When I was a kid," she said, "Dad used to bring me up here to watch the storms. He said if you looked long enough, you could see the light move beneath the waves, like souls finding their way home." Eli's gaze followed hers toward the horizon. Maybe he was right. She turned to him. "You really believe that?" He smiled faintly. "I've seen too many miracles not to." She let out a shaky laugh. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say faith wasn't about proof. It was about remembering light even when you can't see it." "Your grandmother was wise," Eli said, "and she'd probably like your dog." Mara laughed again, and for the first time, it didn't sound forced. The wind softened, carrying the faint scent of salt and wood smoke from the house above. Ranger trotted back, dropping something at Eli's feet. A piece of driftwood, smooth and pale, shaped almost like a ship's prow. Eli bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Guess even he's got a taste for the sea." They started back up the trail. From below, the tide rolled in gently, lapping at the rocks with a sound like a heartbeat. When they reached the house, Evelyn was standing by the window, her shawl pulled tight but her face serene. "It's strange," she said, "but I think I can hear them. My husband, my boy, not calling for help anymore, just saying goodbye." Mara approached and took her hand. Then maybe the sea finally kept its promise. Evelyn smiled faintly. "It always does, in its own cruel way." She turned toward the fireplace, where the flames had burned low. "You know," she said softly, "I spent half my life asking God why he took them. And now, I think I understand. He didn't take them to punish me. He let me live long enough to forgive them, and myself." Eli's gaze met Mara's. He nodded once, as if sealing the truth in silence. The day passed quietly. They helped Evelyn tidy the workshop, wrapping the old ship models in linen. The radio, silent now, sat on the mantel, its antenna bent, its purpose fulfilled. Every so often, Ranger would wander to the window and stare out at the waves, as if waiting for something more. When dusk came, the horizon blazed with color, the clouds split apart in streaks of gold and rose, and the light touched everything it could, the cliffs, the snow, the calm sea beyond. Mara stepped outside again, unable to resist the pull of that glow. The air was cold enough to sting, but it felt alive. She stood by the cliff's edge, eyes closed, breathing in the peace that followed chaos. Eli joined her quietly. "You did it," he said. She opened her eyes. "No, we did. All of us." She glanced toward the window where Evelyn's figure moved slowly past the firelight. Even her. Ranger pressed against her leg, tail wagging softly. Mara crouched and ruffled his fur. "You too, hero." The sun finally dipped below the horizon. The first stars began to show, pale, trembling points of light against the darkening sky. Eli broke the silence. "You ever think storms are God's way of reminding us he's still here?" Mara looked up at the stars, her voice almost a whisper. "Maybe. Or maybe they're his way of showing us that light always comes after." The wind carried her words out to sea. For a moment, everything seemed to hold still. The cliffs, the waves, even the air itself. Then a soft sound drifted up from below. The distant cry of a gull, echoed by another, then another. Eli smiled. "Sounds like a choir." Mara nodded. "Or a promise." They turned back toward the house, its windows glowing like lanterns against the snow. The path behind them shimmered under the last light, each footprint gleaming before fading into the white. Inside, Evelyn placed the model ship gently on the mantel. Its carved name faced the room. Aurora, the lost found. Ranger curled up by the hearth, letting out a long sigh. The flames flickered, throwing soft gold across the faces of the three souls the storm had brought together. Outside, the wind had stopped entirely. The ocean was still, the sky open. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, a beam of light from the lighthouse cut across the dark, steady, unwavering, eternal. And in that light, all their storms finally rested. Sometimes God's miracles do not come with thunder or flashes of light. They come quietly through people who refuse to give up, through the hands that reach out in storms and the hearts that learn to forgive. Just like Mara, Eli, and Evelyn, we are all called to walk through our own tempests with faith, trusting that God will turn every loss into light. In our daily lives, when we choose kindness over anger and hope over fear, we become part of His miracle. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Today, leave a comment, tell us what you believe about miracles, and type Amen to thank God for the light that still guides us. Subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and redemption, and may God bless you and your family always.